Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, pay data from over 10,000 organisations show on average men are paid more than women at most UK firms. Also this week, cleaning up cobalt. The first ever attempt to ensure cobalt mined in the DRC is ethical. Plus, China tells the US president it's prepared to fight as the world's biggest economies play a high-stakes game of poker on tariff threats. A big reveal in the UK has got people talking about whether your gender matters when it comes to wages. Well, that's because companies are now required to publicly state the difference between what it pays male and female employees. The purpose? To force employers to look at the barriers facing women in the workplace. The gender pay gap isn't about equal pay for equal work. Discrimination in the workforce is already illegal. The gender pay gap instead shows the average difference between how men and women are paid across organisations. And 8 in 10 UK firms pay men more than women. Critics say it's a crude measure, but the UK is one of the first countries in the world to do this. The findings raise lots of questions and they've certainly got people talking. Neave has more.
It is an uncomfortable truth about the society we live in. When it comes to pay, men and women are far from equal. This company employs mostly women. It's hoped that by exposing the pay gap, it will help empower women in the workplace.
It's created so much debate and discussion about pay and about inequality in the workplace. It creates a sort of opportunity for people to think again about whether there is discrimination at their offices perhaps, and how they're perceiving women and how they're defining salaries.
Thousands of British companies employing more than 250 people have been forced to disclose pay details. Around 80% pay men more than women. 13%, including the tech giant Apple, pay women more. And just 8%, including big chains such as KFC, McDonald's and Starbucks, say they have no gap at all. Among the worst offenders is the low-cost airline Ryanair, where women make up only 3% of top earners. That's excluding most of the company's management, who are based in Ireland. Ryanair blames the figures on men mainly filling pilot roles. The construction industry and the financial sector also have large pay gaps. The average woman employee at Barclays or Lloyds Bank can expect to be paid more than 40% less than the average man. There have been some high-profile pay disputes too, with actress Claire Foy, who plays Queen Elizabeth in the Netflix series The Crown, earning less than her male counterpart. The British Prime Minister's vowed to tackle what she called the burning injustice of gender inequality. Only 30% of MPs are women.
We have to deal with those stereotypes about what kind of jobs men and women can do, about what leadership looks like, why it is that men and women ask for a pay rise just as often as each other, but men are 4 times more likely to get it. I know there are gender pay gap deniers. This data is hopefully starting a conversation about how these people are out of touch with what's actually going on in our country.
The government says that this isn't simply about naming and shaming companies into paying men and women equal amounts of money. It's about kickstarting a public discussion to try and make the workplace as representative as the world around us. There's no punishment for pay gaps, although companies that fail to publish their figures face legal action. Some politicians argue that without a major societal shift, hefty fines are the only way of forcing firms to close the gap.
Well, joining us now from Manchester is Wendy Olsen, Professor of Socio-economics and Head of the Department of Social Statistics at the University of Manchester. Good to have you with us. So what do you think HR managers should be telling their female employees today? You think there'll be a few difficult conversations?
There should be a routine conversation anyway. So an HR manager should have, a process where people review their pay regularly, at least every year, and support people in their pay bargaining.
What do you say to those who criticise the data, though, and say it's not reliable because it doesn't take into account the differences in jobs between men and women?
Yes, it does take that into account because they've broken the data into 4 quartiles. So you've got the different sections of that labor market within the firm. So they've cleverly found a way to make those managerial jobs in the top quartile comparable across firms. And then you have the middle range pay jobs, and then you have the low paid jobs. So if you're a low paid worker, it's a very interesting grid to look at. I mean, if I can just run down for your viewers what the actual regulations say, you've got to give the mean pay in each of those quartiles and then give the bonuses. Now, a lot of these large firms have a very high percentage of men and women on bonuses, and the bonuses have a much higher pay gap than the pay. So even if there was some invalidity in there and it hasn't been checked by government, I think it's still going to reveal an awful lot. And we have seen an oversupply of people offering their data. There's 9,600 at the last
I'm sure some of the critics will say there's
8,000.
a lot of jobs lumped together, critics will say, within those quartiles. There's a lot of different types of managerial jobs.
Yeah, well, that's why it's surprising that there would be any pay gap. You know, if the jobs were all a jumble and there's all the ones that are, let's say, managerial and technical are in that top quartile, then why would there be any gender difference in the pay? You know, each of those, in theory, should be having equal pay or pay according to their deserts. And so there shouldn't be any gender pay gap. There's no reason for gender difference per se.
Well, the ONS says, this is one of the arguments of the critics of the ONS data, or how the ONS data is being interpreted. They go on to say, even the ONS itself says there's not one single measure that adequately explains or deals with the complex issue of gender pay differences. Are we reading too much into the data, as critics would say, when we assume it's down to gender discrimination?
It's not all down to gender discrimination. There's also the fact of occupational segregation, as you've pointed out. So you might be well paid in the job that you're in, but you might have left a better job for having a child. And this is very gendered. So if there are work stereotypes around caring for children, then it's very likely we'll keep having this gender difference in pay.
So you wouldn't accept one of the critiques which I read today, for example, of this data, that some of the gender pay gap might be explained as a result of women choosing to do more part-time jobs, which are generally not as well paid as full-time jobs.
The question you should be asking is, why are part-time jobs so badly paid? Now, the pay gap regulations don't allow any modification of the average pay according to being part-time.
But the critics would say that would apply to men and women.
Hourly figure. That would apply to men and women. So men who've predominantly now gone into part-time jobs when they're young, perhaps while they're studying, there are a lot more men now in part-time jobs, and they are very low paid. So if it's a particular sector that's low paid, that may be justified. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is actually equalization of pay in those jobs when the men joined in the jobs. And that's very interesting.
Fabulous. Good talking to you. Thanks so much for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Now, my next guest, Julian Jessup, is the chief economist at the IEA Institute of Economic Affairs. He's written a critique this week saying the gender pay gap reporting isn't fit for purpose. I asked him why he isn't a supporter.
Two problems. First of all, the data themselves are not accurately reported. So we often read that men are paid differently from women as if it paid differently for doing the same job, when in fact it's other differences. For example, whether they're working full-time or part-time, or the type of occupation that they're doing. So the data are frequently misrepresented. But
well, here's a comeback to that one, Julian. Forgive me, I was just going over this point with supporters of the data who say, well, the data did put people into quartiles of whether they're management or below management. So there was some attempt to take into consideration the difference in jobs. How do you respond to that?
Well, not enough. I mean, one of the biggest and most important differences is between full-time and part-time incomes, which isn't reflected in these data at all. But also, even to the extent that we do find out that men are overrepresented in some occupations rather than others, that isn't necessarily evidence of discrimination. It's certainly not evidence that people are being paid differently for doing the same job. There may be a whole host of reasons why men and women choose or end up in different professions, which have nothing to do with discrimination, certainly nothing to do with the fault of the employers. But many employers are being demonized. Those companies with large gender pay gaps in favor of men are being described as the worst performers or being named and shamed, which I don't think is the right approach at all.
Now, even if the data is not being interpreted accurately, if it does show shall we say, a scarcity of women in certain jobs and senior roles, doesn't that reveal some level of gender discrimination or bias in the workplace?
Well, it may well do, but frankly, we knew that already. We could look at the board of any large UK company, and we can observe straight away that there aren't that many women on those boards, by and large. So we knew that already.
One study I found by professors from New York, Pennsylvania and Haifa universities found that when women moved into occupations in large numbers, those jobs began paying less, even after controlling for things like experience, education, skills, geography and so on. I mean, can we really say that companies are innocent?
Well, I don't think we can say whether a particular company is guilty or innocent based on the data that's being provided. To be absolutely clear, I have no doubt at all there is discrimination in the workplace in the UK. I do think there's a lot less discrimination than there used to be, and in particular, women have benefited from the fact it's now illegal to pay a man differently from a woman for doing work of equal value. But to start from the assumption that any gender pay gap is due to discrimination, I think it is unhelpful.
How should we then be looking at or measuring the gender pay gap, and how should we be interpreting it then? What's the right approach?
What we want companies to do, though, is to have a long-term plan to improve these numbers over the next 5 or 10 years. And chasing them every single year to monitor their performance against flawed metrics, I don't think is going to help. But the sorts of data I'd like to see collected are more things like the full-time versus part-time difference, but also a proper analysis of why women aren't in the top jobs. I mean, let's actually ask them, is it because they've chosen not to? For example, because they have family or caring responsibilities? If that's the case, is there actually a problem there? Or is it that they would like to take those jobs but simply can't afford the childcare, or their partner, for whatever reason, is not willing to help out at home? And I think we need to get into those sorts of factors.
Or it could be because they're not given enough of opportunity to move into those positions. Is that not a third possibility? You know?
Oh, certainly. I'm sure there,
I mean,
there
is there
are
any evidence to actually
companies
back
out
up
there
some of
that-
those scenarios which you're saying, which they're actually making a choice not to go into these senior positions?
Well, there's the evidence of talking to women on a daily basis. I mean, there are plenty of women who are, highly educated, highly skilled, who have decided to stay at home to look after their children, and that's their free choice.
Anecdotal, but
equally,
nothing
there are plenty of women
scientific,
who
right?
decide. Oh no, there's plenty of studies that academics and economists more generally have been doing to show that relatively little of the gender pay gap can be explained by outright discrimination. It can, by and large, it is due to choices that people have made.
All right, great to get your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
US stocks are on track for their worst ever April since the Great Depression, and a lot of that's got to do with trade fears. Will the leaders of the world's two largest economies embark on an all-out trade war or reach a trade compromise? On Thursday, the war of words between US President Donald Trump and China escalated. The fear now is damaging tariff threats will become reality. Then imports will become more expensive for companies and the economic outlook will sour. Adrian Brown has more from Beijing.
Well, within hours of President Trump effectively threatening a third round of tariffs against China, the response from Beijing was angry and swift. President Trump said he'd asked his trade representative to determine whether $100 billion worth of further tariffs were warranted, and if so, where those tariffs should be applied. Well, a few hours later, a statement appeared on the website of China's Commerce Ministry, and it warned that China was ready to pay any cost in any trade war with the United States. And its spokesman went even further.
If they insist on unilateralism and trade protectionism against the wishes of China and the international community, we will fight to the death at any cost. We will resolutely fight back and take new measures and protect the interests of our country and the people.
Well, just a day ago, of course, the United States had sought to try to lower the temperature with China, saying the threat of more tariffs was simply the next step in the negotiating process. Now we are back to the brinkmanship. On Friday, China's state media, which of course is controlled by the Communist Party, sought to portray China as the victim, saying Trump was simply trying to stop China's rise. And the media had another blunt message: China doesn't do surrender.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, who's been looking at your Facebook data? Some very unhappy lawmakers will be asking Facebook's CEO some tough questions about how he runs the world's biggest social media network. But first, the robots may not be coming for our jobs after all, at least not as many of them. See, a new OECD report says fewer jobs are at risk from advances in artificial intelligence and robotics than previously feared. But the Paris-based think tank warns young people could find it harder to find work in the future as entry-level posts have a higher risk of automation. Well, the world's largest music streaming company, Spotify, is changing. As of this week, it's now a publicly owned company. And there could be more transformation down the line too. Spotify knows what we listen to and when, and it wants to make money from that knowledge. Although it's never turned a profit, it's changing how the music industry works. Rob Reynolds has more from Los Angeles.
Spotify's debut on Wall Street came without the bell-ringing and hullabaloo that normally accompany hot initial public offerings. The company says its focus isn't on making a splash, but on building a long-term strategy.
We do think demand is going to be strong for Spotify. It's quite a sexy stock. It's quite a sexy industry.
The 12-year-old Swedish company jumped into a dominating position in music streaming, convincing customers to pay a monthly subscription fee, allowing them to choose from millions of songs online instead of paying to own individual tunes. Starting out with a handful of people working out of a backroom Stockholm office, Spotify now has 71 million paid subscribers worldwide. That's double the number of its closest competitor, Apple Music. The streaming model was initially resisted by the music industry, but since streaming became widespread around 2015, Spotify has helped drag the music industry into profitability after a decade and a half in the doldrums. Streaming service revenue now accounts for 65% of recorded music sales. Spotify also changed the way people listen to music. Playlists dominated by hit songs, partly chosen by artificial intelligence and algorithms, now influence what consumers hear instead of individually developed tastes and preferences. Spotify has not yet turned a profit, but the company expects to have 96 million subscribers and more than $6 billion in revenue by the end of this year. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Los Angeles.
A Chinese company has been accused of mining sand illegally and almost destroying an entire village in Mozambique. Amnesty International has launched an investigation into the Hayu mining company. Charlotte Bellis reports.
Ngonya is a small fishing village built upon sand dunes in northern Mozambique. It's an idyllic setting for a simple life. But on their doorstep, a global battle is building, the people of Ngonya versus China's Hayu Mining Company. The villagers' complaint, Hayu's sand mining blocked lagoons, which they say caused severe flooding in 2015. 48 homes were swept out to sea, and more than 170 damaged and buried. Amnesty International spent 2 years investigating how it happened.
The report reveals the corporate conduct of a Chinese mining company that threatened to wipe out a small village of about 1,000 people into the Indian Ocean.
Hayu mines the sand to extract certain minerals. It boasts it can process 20 tonnes of sand a day and employs more than 500 people. China is the largest source of direct foreign investment in the country and holds the majority of its foreign debt. The investment should be welcome in Ngonya, which lies in one of Mozambique's poorest provinces.
The point, unfortunately, is that the company and the government are putting the profits first than the human development and also the human rights of these people.
Almost 300 people are now homeless, but Hayu says the flooding was a result of abnormally heavy rain. The company received its mining concession in 2011 and denies it's altered the dunes in any way. 99% of the sand remains at its point of origin and is not extracted. This contradicts the idea that there was a change in the channel for underground waters, which is not true. Time is not on the side of these Mozambicans. Satellite images show mining activities getting ever closer to the village. They want to safeguard what's left of their lives and want the government to investigate Haiyu and negotiate for compensation. Nagonia was named after a crocodile that taunted locals from a nearby lagoon. These days, villagers say the crocodile comes from China.
Well, you've heard about blood diamonds. What about blood batteries? Cobalt is a key raw material in electric batteries, which are likely to drive the future of automation. Lithium-ion batteries also power smartphones, so prices have soared over 200% in the past 5 years. Well, most of the resource is mined in dangerous conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC is home to 60% of the world's cobalt, and some mines were found to employ child labour. There's growing consumer awareness, though, of the high human cost of cobalt mining. Now, joining us from Greenville in South Carolina via Skype is Nicholas Garrett. Nicholas is the Executive Director and co-founder of RCS Global, a UK supply chain audit company which is in charge of implementing the first ever pilot scheme to produce ethical cobalt from Congo. Sounds fascinating. Good to have you with us. But how do you actually audit the global cobalt supply chain?
Hi there, good morning, Sammy. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, the actual auditing process of the supply chain is relatively complex because the supply chain obviously spans the entire globe. In the past, you would have mine site assessments at the very beginning of the supply chain. You would look at refiners and smelters and their feedstock. Equally, there is an audit process that happens in quite often in Asia, where much of the manufacturing of cobalt-containing products occurs, where there's factory audits involved, and obviously then the chain eventually lands up at the large automotive brands, electronic brands, etc., that use cobalt in the batteries that power the devices that we like to use.
Okay, but when you're talking about the Congo in particular, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's a very different situation when it comes to DRC mines, isn't it? Do you actually have people there on the ground monitoring what's going on, making sure there's no child labor, for example, involved, and so on and so forth?
So the way it works is that we permanently monitor mine sites and trading chains for human rights incidents and environmental issues through our own monitoring agents. So these are trained agents that use a smartphone application to register any incidents that they observe or that they get reported.
And are they there 24 hours a day sort of thing, or as long as the mines are open, is a monitor always present and watching?
Yes, so this is correct. Obviously, with humans, you obviously have to account for sick days, etc. But in principle, the monitors are there 24/7. This data is available to supply chain participants, which means that if you are sitting in Palo Alto or if you're sitting in Stuttgart in Germany in your headquarters of your automotive brand, you will be able to log on and see the conditions of the production at the very bottom of your supply chain.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for explaining it to us.
You're welcome.
And finally, unlucky number 87. Facebook has revealed it compromised the privacy of millions more users than initially reported. Chief Executive Mark Zuckerberg says he won't stand down because of the scandal, and no one at the company has been fired. Alan Fisher reports.
Facebook has come in for heavy criticism after it was revealed the data of millions of users had been shared with outside parties. Initially, it was thought by media sources the breach took in 50 million users. Now it's been revealed by Facebook itself after an internal review. The figure is much higher, 87 million. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg told reporters on a conference call he had no plans to step down and the company would change the way it handled users' data in the future.
Now, we have to go through every part of our relationship with people and make sure that we're taking a broad enough view of our responsibility. It's not enough to just connect people. We have to make sure that those connections are positive and that they're bringing people closer together. It's not enough to just give people a voice. We have to make sure that people are not using that voice to hurt people or to spread disinformation. And it's not enough to give people tools to sign into apps. We have to ensure that all those developers protect people's information too.
Our next focus. Facebook didn't tell any of its users back in 2015 that information had been accessed by the firm Cambridge Analytica which was contracted by the Trump presidential campaign to help election ad targeting. It now faces questions about the number of fake news stories posted during the election and the presence of Russian operatives on the service. The company also had links to another firm, which provided analysis for the Vote Leave campaign in the British EU referendum. Of the 87 million potentially affected users, more than 70 million are in the US. Mark Zuckerberg will face a US House committee next week to discuss the scandal, and several states are investigating what happened and if any laws were broken.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here now. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.